Okay, as noted before, we are going to start on this particular section here, which allows us to develop locally, test what that Docker container looks like in an isolated environment. Because if it works locally from a carved out instance, it's going to replicate here on the app. And so it's important to test it locally in an isolated environment before we push it. So first things first, I have a working template of all the necessary files that we'll need to get started. This is kind of a minimalist setup here, where we have our Docker file, our Azure master YAML file, which we'll get into later, in our root directory, and then our app with our necessary app components. So server, UI, global data files, everything like that. This can certainly be built upon. So if there needs to be another folder here that's like data prep or anything like that, it's all, that's fine. You do want to be careful of memory sizes. If the data gets too big, we'll have to talk about accessing that through some sort of cloud storage, which is why I put these here. But for the 404 app, it can fit on the Docker container itself, and there's no security issues because it's public data. So just, either clone this repository or copy it or whatever you need to do to get a folder structure that is similar to the one, that is this folder structure. So we see here it's mimicked, and we're going to go to Visual Studio Code to start messing around with this stuff. Now, before we go any further, you are going to have a couple downloads. So if you don't already have Docker Desktop downloaded, it's important that we have this on our machine. This is the engine that obviously will be building those Docker images, and also, on your local machine, carving out a blank slate of a computer, which is operating system agnostic. So it's going to build all those different layers that we need to match whatever we put in the cloud. So just download this for Windows, go through the prompts, and it'll start up. There'll be a little icon here in the corner called Docker Desktop running, and that'll sort of be with you from here on out. After you're done doing that, we're going to download Visual Studio Code. Again, just go to Visual Studio Download in Google, download what you need for Windows, and follow the prompts. I'd pause the video here, get that stuff done, and when all this is installed, we can sort of keep going. Okay, I just assume that everything is up and running. We will jump into Visual Studio Code. Now, when you open it up, it probably won't look like this. There'll be something of a welcome screen here. But Visual Studio Code works with folders, and so what you're going to want to do, the first thing is just open and point to the folder that our app's in. So if we point to Report Azure, we select the folder, and the contents of the folder are mimicked here. And this is nice because, as we'll see here in a minute, it's just wonderful to be able to debug and work with this Docker file in a way that reduces the amount of shell commands we're going to need to write. We have our terminal here, so we have like the shell open, but it's going to populate that with any of the commands that we'll need, so we don't have to memorize those things. Visual Studio Code works on extensions, and they're kind of like packages that sort of get plugged into this stuff. And so if you go to View and Extensions, and you're going to want to get the Docker extension, one by Microsoft, because we're going to be plugging into Microsoft to push that image. Once you're done downloading that, you should have a Docker image or Docker logo here, and this will contain all of your local images and your containers, and this registries here is nice because this is how you'll connect to Azure. So when we want to push that image, going from Visual Studio Code to our online registry, we'll just connect this way. And so I've already done this, but if you just hit connect to registry, you can click Azure, and there'll be some prompts to sign you in. It should do it for you, and so you'll get something of a window popping up that looks a lot like you're signing into Microsoft 365, and you'll log in, and it'll tell you that you're connected. Any issues with that, just Google and research how to do that, but once we make those connections, then we're all set. So if we go back to our Docker file, this is our Docker file. And there's a lot going on here, but a lot of notes too. I think this Docker file is actually pretty small if I were to take away all the spaces and notes I have listed. I wrote the notes for for obviously this tutorial, but also for myself to remember what some of these commands are doing. It starts off with a from command, and this is basically telling the base image of this new computer. Like, is it going to be a Windows computer? Is it going to be a Linux computer? Like, what operating system am I working with here? And so we're telling them it's a Linux operating system, and we're working with the shiny verse, 3.6.1. And so this can be updated as your versions update. You can feel free to update this. This particular image, this particular base image, is actually maintained by a famous Stack Overflow guy you've probably seen around named Dirk Abudil. I can't even pronounce his last name, but him and a few other people maintain this. All these run commands are shell commands. So once that VM image is up and running, these things are shell commands to get all the dependencies that we need. This portion was actually developed by Microsoft during our work with the Henson Group. It was to allow the Azure Active Directory B2C functionality to work on a Docker container with an R application inside of it. These are supposed to be, it's supposed to be part of a later Microsoft update, so these may not be necessary in the future, but for now we're going to hold on to them. Here's some more, just shell commands to install the latest updates. And this is what really matters here. So this is where we're going to have all of our packages loaded that relate to your Shiny app. And this will be changed. I did notice that everything has to be on one line. I'm not quite sure why. I just ran into that error. And so however many packages you have, I would keep it on the same line going out. And then these copy commands, these are actually two arguments. This is copy from our local directory, like our local root directory, and create a file structure called server shiny server on all these slashes. And the same thing here, we're copying the contents of our app, everything in here, and we're putting it in this directory. The expose 338, we are specifying a port that will be exposed when our app is up and running. This is actually not necessary for Azure App Service, like the app service plans that we'll be connecting to, but they are necessary for just an individual VM instance that you had running. And so just keep it 3838 and everything will be fine. User required for the Shiny server. I'm not quite sure why this is here, but I was told to keep it there for Shiny server, and so there it is. This should largely be copy and paste. Nothing much here should change. These dependencies I have here was actually because the SF package for mapping polygons and leaflet required specific Debian dependencies that I had to sort of look up. But I've run some pretty big apps with a lot of packages, and this Docker file's held up. So, barring any really exotic package, I imagine a lot of this stuff will be just fine. But whatever packages you invoke in your global script, just make sure you put here, and that'll be the only thing that should change. Docker files should be pretty stable. I've talked to some folks who've used the same Docker file for a year with small changes, but nothing big. So once you've copied and pasted that and you have your folder structure here, this is where the magic of Visual Studio Code starts to become apparent. Normally you're going to have to write a shell command that gets Docker running and builds an image. To avoid that, we just hit Docker file and right click and just hit build image. It's going to ask us to name it. That's fine. And so you can see in the terminal, those are the commands that we would have to do in our shell. They're not super complicated, but it's still nice to not have to remember those. These steps here, Docker just ripped through these steps, but that's because it's using a lot of cached information. So when you run this the first time, this should probably take 10 to 15 minutes just to get the Shiny server installed on that computer, and it may be more depending on how large the app is. And so you're going to want to so the first time it'll be kind of crazy, and that's actually why it's so advantageous to start with Visual Studio Code as opposed to instantiating the entire pipeline workflow, because as you're developing, you're going to want to know kind of right away if something is going wrong with your Docker file or deployment. But if you do this, pipelines in GitHub, as fantastic as this workflow is, it doesn't cache any information, and so every time you're launching your image, it's rebuilding that thing from scratch, which means it could take 10 to 15 minutes before you realize that there's something wrong. And that just lends itself to sort of distracted debugging, because I mean, 10 to 15 minutes, you're obviously going to go start working on something else, and your mind's going to start to shift, and it's just not very productive. And so, while it seems like an extra step to do Visual Studio Code, I've found that it saves me time in the long run because I can iterate very quickly and keep my mind focused on, making sure all the pieces and components work. So now that my Docker file's built, we can jump into the Docker logo here and check it in the image. So I have it in report 404 report Azure. I have a lot of images in here, and that's just because I've been messing around a lot, but I imagine yours should be empty. Hit run, and again, it's going to run the commands to expose that port and launch it on that isolated instance that is now built on our computer. And so we see here we have our container up and running. We can open in the browser, and an error has occurred. That's okay, because we can figure out what's going on. So errors should be expected during this process, and so the way we can figure out what's going on is we can take a look at the logs. So just right click on this thing, view logs, and it's going to pull up what should look familiar. So this is down here is often what you see when you're launching your app in RStudio, and you're going to get the same error messages. So there we go. Error. It looks like, okay, so I have a library in the app that was not specified in the Docker container. I'm sorry, in the Docker file. So if I go back to the Docker file, rsconnect, we can see I don't have it here, but I actually don't want rsconnect on this particular one. So I can go back to my app, global. Okay, yeah, it looks like I just forgot to eliminate that one. Run the app, make sure everything's working okay. Perfect, everything seems to be running fine. Let's go ahead and rebuild that Docker image. Fine. Yeah, and so just this part, this part alone, took me 2 seconds, in where I would have had to wait, another 20 minutes for all that stuff to work out. And I can just go right back into it. I can, better stop you. Run that fixed Docker image, okay, and then we're going to open in browser. Great, here it is. So we have our application that has been Dockerized and is running in that isolated environment. And this is definitely the first step that needs to be worked out before we push it to Azure. So we have all this looking great. Now so now that it's sort of working locally and we have all of our things needed here, now we're going to push it. Now we want to push it to the Azure registry where we can pick it up by the app service, which is just a server. And now we had connected to our registries before, and we're going to go back to our image, and instead of running it, we're going to push it. And your subscription should come up here. TBD Analytics Group, that's actually not active. This is the one the Henson Group sort of set us up with, so we'll choose our directory. This is the container registry we want. This assumes that we have a container registry in our subscription that it can push to. If you don't, container registries are cheap, and it's just a place to house these things. And it's going to ask us what we want to call it. That works. Okay, and we're off. This step may take a while. But that is the part. looks like it has been pushed. So at this point, we're sort of done locally. Now we need to check things on our in our Azure subscription. So if we go to Azure, we log in. There's TBD container registry. So this is where all our container registries are. We're going to look at our repositories. And there it is. So 404 report Azure. So I have my COVID dashboard and HCBS app. Those are other, container Docker images that we could use. We're going to jump in here, and there it is. We could from here actually run it, deploy it to the web app, or run an instance. That's very helpful. We're going to stop here, and in the next video, we'll stand up a server that we'll use to pull that image and host it. Before we start to put in these pipelines. So that is how we solve or debug and set up a Docker container. Yeah, feel free to go back, and I will see you in the next video.